The alarm on my ship screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the command deck. My second officer, a young Vantic named Cell, turned to me with wide eyes and said the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Commander, the scout ship is gone. Not damaged, not disabled, gone." I remember laughing. I actually laughed, right there on the bridge, in front of my crew. A scout ship does not simply vanish. Scout ships get delayed. They lose signal in storms. They drift off course. They do not disappear without a trace, without a single distress call, without so much as a flicker of wreckage on our sensors. But that is exactly what happened, and it was only the beginning. Let me explain who I am, because you will not understand the weight of what I am about to tell you unless you understand what I once believed. My name is Vorn Koth, and for over 300 years I served as a commander in the Osanth Dominion. We were not a small power. We were not a young civilization stumbling through the stars for the first time. We were ancient. We were vast. We had walked among the stars since before most species had learned to walk upright on their own worlds. We had conquered 84 different species. 84. I do not say this with pride now, though I once did. I say it because you need to understand the scale of what we believed ourselves to be. We were not bullies picking on the weak. We were, in our own minds, the natural order of the galaxy. Strength ruled. Fear maintained peace. A single show of force, properly delivered, could bring an entire civilization to its knees without a single life lost on either side. That was our method. That was our pride. Fear was our language, and every species we had ever met understood it fluently. Every species except one. We found humanity almost by accident. A routine survey mission passed near a yellow star on the edge of what we considered unclaimed territory, and our sensors picked up radio signals. Old ones. Crude broadcasts leaking out into space, decades old by the time we received them. Music, voices, something that sounded like laughter, and something else that sounded like grief. Our analysts studied the signals for weeks. Their conclusion was simple, and in hindsight, laughably incomplete. A pre-spaceflight species. Primitive. No orbital defenses detected. No signs of advanced weaponry. Population estimated in the billions, spread across a single world. Recommends standard first contact protocol. Demonstration of strength, followed by terms of compliance. Standard protocol. We had used it 84 times before. It always worked the same way. We would send a small fleet, enough to be seen, but not so much that it looked like an invasion. We would destroy something meaningless, an asteroid, an abandoned moon, anything visible enough to make the point without taking a single life. Then we would broadcast our terms, submit and live under our protection, prosper as one of our client worlds, or resist and be removed from the galaxy entirely. Every single time, without exception, the target species chose to submit. Why would they not? We were older, stronger, faster, and utterly without mercy, when mercy was not required. So when the order came down from the Dominion Council to prepare a demonstration fleet for the Yellow Star system, I volunteered without hesitation. I wanted this posted to my record. 85th species. 85th, peaceful conquest. My name written into history as the commander who brought another world into the fold without a single shot needing to land on a living target. I sent one scout ship ahead first, as always, to gather final details before the main fleet arrived. A small, fast vessel with minimal crew, designed only to observe and report. It entered the system quietly, positioned itself beyond what we believed to be the range of their primitive detection systems, and began recording. Then it stopped transmitting. At first, we assumed a technical failure. These things happened, rarely, but they happened. I ordered a second, larger scout to investigate, along with a small escort of 3 combat vessels, more than enough to handle any technology a pre-spaceflight civilization could possibly possess. I remember feeling almost embarrassed sending 4 ships to check on one. It felt like overreacting to a coincidence. The second scout entered the system. It reported normal readings for 6 hours. Then, without warning, all 4 ships lost contact within the same 11-minute window. I stood on my bridge, staring at empty space on the tactical display, where 4 Osanth vessels should have been. My crew looked to me for an explanation, and I had none to give them. Every instinct built over 3 centuries of service told me this was impossible. A species with no visible orbital defense, no detected weapons platforms, no signs of advanced propulsion, had somehow made 5 of our ships disappear without a single warning shot, without a single distress signal, without leaving so much as a debris trail our sensors could detect. I want you to understand something about my people. We did not panic easily. Panic was considered a weakness bred out of our species generations ago through careful selection and discipline. But I felt something that day that I had never felt before in 300 years of service. It was not quite fear. It was closer to confusion, the deep and uncomfortable kind that comes when the universe stops behaving the way you were taught it always behaves. I requested permission to send the full demonstration fleet ahead of schedule. The Dominion Council granted it within the hour. They were as confused as I was, and confusion, among my people, was always answered with force. If the primitive humans had somehow developed a defense system we had failed to detect, then a full fleet would overwhelm it regardless. 12 capital ships, 40 support vessels. More firepower than had been required to subdue any of our previous 84 conquests combined. I led that fleet myself. We dropped out of transit space at the edge of the yellow star system, and for the first time, I saw humanity's homeworld with my own eyes. It was, I will admit, beautiful. Blue oceans, white clouds, green and brown continents catching the light of their star. It looked peaceful. It looked exactly like the kind of world that should submit quietly and be grateful for the protection we offered. We broadcast our standard message immediately, translated through algorithms built from decades of intercepted radio signals. The message was simple. We are the Osanth Dominion. We have observed the disappearance of 5 of our vessels in this system. We demand an explanation and the immediate return of any surviving crew. Failure to respond honestly will be considered an act of hostility. The response came back almost instantly, faster than I expected from a civilization we believed had no functioning space communication network. A single voice, male, speaking in a language our translators struggled to parse at first, because of how calm it sounded, despite the words themselves. This is Colonel Daniel Price, of Earth Defense Command. Your ships entered restricted space without authorization and were engaged according to standing orders. There were no survivors. If you wish to avoid further losses, I strongly recommend you leave this system immediately and do not return. I remember the silence on my bridge after that message finished playing. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Standing orders. Restricted space. As though this was routine to them. As though the destruction of 5 advanced Osanth vessels was simply a Tuesday afternoon exercise for a species we had classified, in our own official records, as pre-spaceflight and primitive. My tactical officer, a Vantic named Oren, who had served under me for over 60 years, broke the silence first. "Commander," he said, his voice unsteady in a way I had never heard from him before. "Our scanners still show no active weapons platforms anywhere in this system. No orbital defense grid, no detectable ship movement beyond a handful of what appear to be unarmed research and transport vessels. According to every sensor reading we possess, this species has nothing capable of destroying even a single one of our scout ships, let alone 5. And yet," I said, 5 of our ships are gone, and a man who calls himself Colonel Daniel Price just told us it was standard procedure. I made a decision that day that I would spend the rest of my life regretting, though at the time it felt like the only logical choice available to me. I refused to believe that a species this technologically limited could have destroyed our vessels through actual combat superiority. I convinced myself, and I convinced the Council when I reported back, that this had to be some kind of trick, a bluff, perhaps a lucky ambush using some crude but effective weapon we simply had not detected yet, something explainable, something that did not require rewriting everything we understood about how the galaxy worked. So I ordered the fleet to proceed with the demonstration, exactly as planned. We selected a barren moon on the far edge of the system, uninhabited, insignificant, the kind of target we had destroyed on 84 previous occasions to make our point without cost. I gave the order myself. Fire. The moon shattered exactly as intended, a brilliant flash visible even from the homeworld itself according to our sensors. This was the moment, in every previous first contact, when the target species contacted us within hours, terrified, ready to negotiate terms of submission. Humanity did not contact us within hours. Humanity did not contact us at all. Instead, 40 minutes after the demonstration, our sensors detected 6 ships launching from the homeworld's atmosphere. 6 ships, small compared to ours, moving with a speed and precision our engineers could not immediately explain. They were not fleeing, they were not hiding, they were approaching us directly, in formation, without a single attempt at communication. I ordered our fleet to hold position and prepare defenses, still certain, even then, that whatever these 6 ships represented could not possibly threaten a force of 52 Osanth vessels. I had 300 years of experience telling me this was impossible. I had 84 conquered species behind me as proof that fear worked, that force worked, that nothing this small and this crude could stand against what we had built. I was wrong about almost everything I believed that day, and within the next several hours I would begin to understand just how wrong, though the full truth would take far longer to sink in. As those 6 human ships closed the distance between us, moving with a calm and terrible purpose that our translators could not find words for, I felt something twist in my chest that I would later learn to recognize properly. It was the first real taste of fear I had experienced in 3 centuries, and it would not be the last. Behind me, Oren whispered something I will never forget. "Commander," he said, staring at the tactical display as the 6 ships arranged themselves into a formation none of our records recognized, "I do not think they are afraid of us at all." He was right. And that single realization, small as it seemed in that moment, was the first crack in everything my people had ever believed about our place among the stars. The 6 human ships did not fire first. I want to make that clear, because it matters to everything that happened afterward. They simply positioned themselves at the edges of our formation, spread out in a pattern that seemed almost lazy, almost careless, as if they were not concerned in the slightest about being surrounded by 52 of our vessels. I ordered a second communication attempt. This time I spoke myself, transmitting on every frequency our systems could reach. "This is Commander Vorn Koth of the Osanth Dominion. We have demonstrated our capability. We offer you the opportunity to submit to peaceful terms. Stand down your vessels and prepare to receive our envoy." The response came from the same voice as before, Colonel Daniel Price, and it was almost gentle in tone, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. "Commander Kath, you destroyed a natural satellite in our home system without provocation, after already losing 5 ships in an unauthorized incursion. I already told you the terms. Leave now. This is the last time I will offer you that choice." I laughed again, though this time it came out thinner than before, less certain. Oren did not laugh with me. Neither did anyone else on the bridge. I gave the order to move our fleet into an aggressive posture, surrounding the 6 ships completely, cutting off any possible retreat. I still believed, even then, that this was a bluff that would collapse the moment they understood their situation was hopeless. Nothing about what happened next felt like a bluff. The 6 ships moved with a coordination that our tactical systems struggled to track in real time. They did not attack the fleet as a whole. They selected individual targets with a precision that suggested they had already studied our ship designs in detail, which should have been impossible given how briefly we had been in this system. Within minutes, 3 of our support vessels lost primary power, not destroyed, disabled, precisely and deliberately disabled, their weapons and shields taken offline while leaving the crew compartments intact. I remember Oren reading off the reports as they came in, his voice growing tighter with every line. "Commander, the Varric has lost shield generation. The Halon Spire reports total weapons failure. The iron current is adrift, engines non-functional, crew unharmed but trapped inside. They are not trying to kill us, I said, more to myself than to anyone else on the bridge. They are trying to disable us. That should have told me something important. It did not. Not fully. Not yet. I still believed we held the advantage in raw numbers and firepower, and I ordered our capital ships to open fire directly on the 6 human vessels, abandoning any pretense of a controlled demonstration. If disabling ships was their preferred method, I reasoned, then overwhelming firepower delivered without hesitation would end this quickly. Our capital ships fired everything they had. 4 of the 6 human vessels absorbed the barrage and kept moving. I do not mean they were undamaged. I could see the impacts on our sensors, the flashes of energy striking their hulls, some kind of shielding technology far beyond anything we had encountered in 84 previous conquests. But they did not stop. They did not retreat. They continued their methodical work of disabling one Osanth vessel after another, moving through our formation like something calm and patient and utterly certain of the outcome. The 5th ship took heavier damage and pulled back toward the edge of the formation, clearly wounded but still functional. The 6th ship, the smallest of the group, moved directly toward my own command vessel. I gave the order to concentrate all remaining fire on that single ship. Every gun on my vessel turned toward it. I watched the tactical display as our weapons struck it again and again, watched its shields flare and dim and flare again, watched it absorb damage that should have ended any vessel a fraction of its size. It did not stop moving toward us. At the last possible moment, just before what I believed would be a collision, the ship veered away and instead released something small and fast toward my own vessel's engine section. I braced for destruction. Instead, our engines simply stopped. Not exploded, not damaged beyond repair. Stopped, cleanly and completely, as though someone had simply reached in and turned them off. My command vessel drifted, powerless, in the middle of what remained of our formation. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 40 minutes. When it ended, our fleet of 52 vessels had been reduced to a collection of drifting, powerless hulls. Not one Osanth ship had been destroyed. Not one crew member, as far as our final reports could confirm, had lost their life. Every single vessel had simply been disabled, methodically and without apparent effort, by 6 human ships that our own sensors had insisted, right up until the moment of engagement, were incapable of posing any threat at all. I sat in my command chair, powerless, humiliated, and utterly confused, as a small human shuttle approached my vessel and requested permission to dock. I granted it, because what other choice did I have? The woman who boarded my ship introduced herself as Captain Grace Hall. She was shorter than most of my crew, unarmed as far as I could tell, and she walked onto my bridge with a calm confidence that unsettled me more than any weapon could have. She did not gloat. She did not threaten. She simply asked to speak with whoever was in command. I stood and told her I was Commander Vorn Koth. "Commander," she said, her translated voice steady and even, "my government would like to understand why your fleet entered our system, destroyed a piece of our territory, and then attempted to engage us in direct combat. We would prefer this situation be resolved through communication rather than continued conflict, but that choice is entirely yours to make." I asked her, plainly, how 6 ships had defeated 52. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and something in her expression, patient, almost sympathetic, made my confusion feel smaller and more foolish than it already did. "Commander," she said, "we have been developing defensive and combat technology on this planet for longer than you might expect. Much of it developed quietly, without broadcasting the details across open channels the way your scans apparently rely on. You based your assessment of our capability entirely on decades-old radio signals never intended to represent our current state of technology or preparedness. I would gently suggest that assumption was a serious miscalculation. I asked what had happened to my 5 ships. They were engaged and neutralized after crossing into space we consider protected, following protocols established well before your arrival, she said. I am sorry for the loss, genuinely, but I must be clear that the responsibility for that outcome rests with the decision to enter that space in the first place. I did not know, in that moment, how to process what I was hearing. Every species we had ever encountered, when faced with a demonstration of our strength, had responded with fear, with pleading, with immediate offers of submission in exchange for their survival. Captain Grace Hall stood on my bridge, having just personally participated in disabling my entire fleet, and spoke to me with something closer to patient disappointment than triumph, as though she had hoped this conversation would not be necessary at all. I asked her what her people wanted from us. Right now, she said, we want your fleet to withdraw from this system. All remaining crew members return to your custody once your ships are restored to functional status, and a clear understanding between our peoples that further aggression will be met with an appropriately measured response. Measured, I repeated. You call this measured? She met my eyes without flinching. Commander, she said, if this had not been measured, we would not be having this conversation right now. Those words stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that day. I did not fully understand their weight in the moment, still clinging to old assumptions, still telling myself that this had been some kind of unfortunate anomaly rather than a genuine revelation about the true nature of the species we had chosen to test. I ordered our fleet, once restored to partial functionality under human supervision, to withdraw from the system as demanded. I reported back to the Dominion Council with what I believed was a full and honest account of events. Though I now understand, I still minimized certain details, still framed the loss in terms that made it sound like misfortune rather than the deliberate result of underestimating an opponent we had refused to properly study. The Council's response was, in hindsight, exactly the response I should have expected from a civilization built entirely around the doctrine of fear as diplomacy. They did not see a defeat that demanded reflection. They saw an insult that demanded correction. 84 species had submitted to us. The idea that an 85th might simply refuse, and worse, might possess the capability to enforce that refusal, was treated not as new information to be studied, but as an aberration to be crushed. I was ordered to return with a significantly larger force, this time under direct council authority rather than my own command, though I would remain as lead tactical officer given my first-hand experience. 300 vessels, an overwhelming display of force that no species in recorded Osanth history had ever required to secure compliance. I raised concerns during the planning sessions, concerns that were dismissed almost as soon as I voiced them. I explained what I had witnessed, the coordination, the shielding technology, the calm and total confidence of Captain Grace Hall as she stood on my bridge discussing the destruction of my fleet as though it were a minor administrative matter. My fellow commanders listened politely and then explained, patiently, as though speaking to a child, that 6 ships were an exception, that 300 ships represented a mathematical certainty of victory that no defensive technology could realistically overcome. I wanted to believe them. 300 years of service, 300 years of doctrine proven correct time after time made it easier to believe them than to trust my own eyes. We arrived back at the Yellow Star system 4 months later, and this time humanity was waiting for us. Not with 6 ships, not with a dozen. Their fleet, when it finally became visible on our sensors, numbered over 200 vessels of their own, positioned in a defensive formation around their homeworld, with a discipline that suggested extensive preparation rather than desperate improvisation. Before a single shot was fired, a transmission arrived on all channels simultaneously, and this time it was not Colonel Daniel Price who spoke. It was a different voice, older, quieter, carrying an authority that needed no volume to command attention. "This is General Edward Finch, of Earth Defense Command. We were told you might return. We hoped you would choose differently. Since you have not, I want to be completely clear about what happens next, so that no one among your people can later claim they were not warned. You are not facing a frightened world anymore, if you ever were. You are facing a species that has survived worse threats than yours from within its own history, and learned, through very hard lessons, exactly what happens when aggression goes unanswered. I offer you one final chance to withdraw. If you choose to proceed instead, you should understand that this will not end as a negotiation. It will end as a lesson, delivered in full to whatever remains of your people when it is over." I remember the silence on the bridge after that transmission ended, 300 vessels strong, and yet somehow, for the first time since I had joined the Asanth Dominion, I felt the full and undeniable weight of being the smaller force in the room. The council commander leading our 300 vessels was a hardened officer named Thesek Vrol, a name known across every Asanth military academy for his role in subduing 4 separate species over the course of his career. He listened to General Edward Finch's warning without visible reaction, then turned to the assembled bridge crew and gave the order to advance regardless. I said nothing. I had already voiced my concerns during planning. Voicing them again now, in the moment before engagement, would have been seen as cowardice, and cowardice among my people carried consequences far worse than death. What followed was not a battle in any sense my people had prepared for. It was closer to a demonstration of exactly how far behind we truly were, though it took hours for the full scope of that gap to become clear. Hours during which I watched decades of doctrine collapse piece by piece in front of me. Human ships did not simply match our firepower. They anticipated our formations before we had fully committed to them, as though they had studied recordings of the previous engagement so thoroughly that our tactics had become predictable to them within a single encounter. They struck weak points in our shield configurations that our own engineers considered theoretical vulnerabilities. The kind of flaw you accept exists in principle, but never expect an enemy to actually locate and exploit in real combat. Ship after ship reported disabling strikes rather than destruction, the same pattern from before, scaled up to match the larger engagement. I remember thinking, even as the reports came in, that this restraint felt deliberate rather than accidental, that a species capable of this level of precision could just as easily have chosen to destroy our vessels outright rather than disable them, and the fact that they continued choosing not to felt less like mercy and more like message. Then, roughly 2 hours into the engagement, the pattern changed. A group of 12 Asanth vessels, coordinating under Thesek Vrol's direct command, attempted a maneuver designed to encircle a cluster of human ships, protecting what our sensors identified as a critical orbital shipyard. It was an aggressive move, the kind that risked significant casualties on both sides if executed against a defended position, and it was exactly the kind of move General Edward Finch's warning had told us not to make. Every one of those 12 vessels was destroyed, not disabled, destroyed, completely and without survivors, in a span of time so short that our sensors barely registered the engagement before it was already finished. I will not pretend I understood, in that moment, the full reasoning behind that shift. It would be explained to me later, during a period of captivity I will describe shortly, by a human officer who spoke with a strange kind of tired patience about her own species' history. Her name was Olivia Marsh, and she had once served in what she called a peacekeeping capacity before the war, and she explained something to me that reshaped everything I thought I understood about the species we had chosen to provoke. "Your people believe fear works because you have only ever used it against those weaker than yourselves," she told me. "It works on the weak, because the weak have no choice but to submit. But my species did not become what we are today by being the strongest force in every room. We spent most of our history being hunted, threatened, and nearly destroyed by other members of our own species, by disease, by our own environment. We learned very early that mercy shown to something that intends to destroy you is not kindness. It is a delay, and every delay costs lives later. We do not escalate quickly, Commander Koth, but once we decide an aggressor will not stop through diplomacy or restraint, we do not allow that aggression to continue in any form. Your commander crossed that line the moment he ordered an assault on a defended position after being clearly warned. That was not an accident of war. That was a demonstration, so that every officer among your people would understand the difference between disabling and finishing. I did not fully believe her at the time. I wanted to believe this was simple wartime rhetoric, the kind of thing any commander might say to unsettle a captured enemy. But the numbers did not lie. Of the 300 vessels sent to that system, only 41 returned to Asanth space in any functional condition. The remainder were either disabled and left drifting under human observation, or destroyed entirely in that single engagement following the encirclement attempt. Thesik Vrol was among those destroyed. I assumed direct command of what remained of the fleet by simple virtue of being the highest-ranking surviving officer, and I made the decision, against every instinct trained into me over 3 centuries, to request a full withdrawal and open communication rather than continuing the engagement. That decision likely saved what remained of my crew, though it did nothing to save my standing with the Dominion Council, who viewed my withdrawal as an act bordering on treason. I did not care. I had seen enough by that point to understand that continuing to fight under the old doctrine would only end in complete destruction, and I told the Council exactly that in my formal report, in language far less careful than I had used the first time. I was relieved of command shortly after, held under a form of house arrest pending formal review, though the review process moved slowly, given how much of the Dominion's attention had shifted entirely toward the growing crisis. During this period of confinement, I was permitted limited contact with a small delegation of human officials who had arrived under a temporary ceasefire to discuss terms, and it was during this time that I met Olivia Marsh properly, along with a younger officer named Peter Lang, who seemed far less patient with our species than his colleague, though he never once raised his voice or resorted to threats. Peter Lang was the one who finally explained, in full and uncomfortable detail, the thing I had been too proud and too frightened to fully accept until that point. He sat across from me in a small, plain room aboard a human vessel that had docked temporarily near our damaged fleet, and he spoke without any of the diplomatic softness I had grown used to from Olivia Marsh. "You keep asking why we did not simply negotiate after the first engagement," he said. "Why we escalated instead of accepting an apology or a withdrawal. I want you to understand something clearly, Commander, because I do not think your people have understood it yet, and I worry that failure to understand it is going to get a great many more of your people killed before this is over. My species spent tens of thousands of years fighting each other before we ever looked to the stars. We fought over land, over food, over ideas, over nothing at all sometimes. We came very close, more than once, to destroying ourselves entirely before we learned better. And through all of that, we learned one lesson above every other lesson history ever taught us. An aggressor who is only ever met with proportional response, who is only ever pushed back exactly as far as they pushed forward, will simply try again later, when the moment is more convenient for them. The only way to end a cycle of aggression permanently is to make continuing that aggression so costly, so absolute in its consequences, that no rational actor would ever consider attempting it again. We are not fighting you because we hate you, Commander. We do not know you well enough to hate you. We are fighting you because your Dominion has done this 84 times before, and every single one of those 84 species believed, right up until the moment they submitted, that resistance might have been possible if they had only tried a little harder. We intend for there to be no ambiguity about what happens to a species that resists us properly, not for your benefit, for the benefit of the next species you might have considered testing had this gone differently." I asked him, because I could not stop myself, whether that meant his species intended to destroy mine entirely. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and something in his expression suggested this question troubled him more than he wanted to admit. "That depends entirely on what your leadership chooses to do next," he said. "We do not want extinction. We have never wanted extinction, not even during the worst periods of our own history, when it might have been the easier choice against each other. What we want is an ending so complete and so undeniable that the very idea of testing us again becomes unthinkable, not just for your people, but for every civilization watching from a distance and drawing their own conclusions about what happened here. Whether that ending involves your species' survival in some form is a question your leadership is currently answering, whether they realize it or not, with every choice they continue to make." I returned to Dominion space not long after that conversation, released as part of a broader prisoner exchange negotiated during the temporary ceasefire, though I returned to a council that had already decided, in my absence, to reject any further diplomatic contact with humanity entirely. They viewed the losses so far as unacceptable but not yet decisive, and they had already begun mobilizing what they called a corrective force, a fleet larger than any assembled in Dominion history, intended to end the conflict through overwhelming numbers regardless of the cost. I argued against this decision in every session I was permitted to attend. I described what I had witnessed. I relayed, as accurately as I could, the words spoken to me by Olivia Marsh and Peter Lang, though I could see in the faces of the council members that my account was being received not as a warning but as evidence that I had been compromised somehow during my captivity, perhaps manipulated, perhaps simply weakened by fear into believing our enemy's own propaganda. I was not reinstated to command. Instead, I was assigned as a tactical advisor to the new corrective fleet, a role that gave me influence over strategy without any actual authority to change the fundamental decision that had already been made. I watched, powerless, as the Dominion prepared to commit nearly a third of its entire military strength to a single overwhelming assault, still believing, even after everything that had happened, that sufficient numbers could overcome any technological or strategic disadvantage. I knew, by that point, exactly how this would end. I had heard it explained to me plainly, by people who did not seem to take any pleasure in saying it. But knowing something and being able to stop it from happening are very different things, and I had no power left to stop what was already in motion. The corrective fleet launched 8 months after my return, and it was, by every measure the Dominion had ever used to judge military strength, the single largest force our species had ever assembled. 900 vessels. Every available reserve pulled from every border world, leaving several outer colonies with only minimal defense in order to gather enough strength for what the Council believed would be a final and decisive strike against humanity's home system. I served aboard the flagship as tactical advisor, watching the preparations unfold with a growing sense of dread I could not share with anyone around me without risking accusations of disloyalty. I had already been marked, quietly, as someone whose judgment could not be fully trusted after my time in captivity. Speaking too openly against this operation would have ended with me removed from the fleet entirely, and some small part of me still hoped that my presence, my voice, might matter in the moment it counted most. We arrived at the edge of the yellow star system to find humanity had not been idle in the months since our last engagement. Their fleet had grown, and more than that, it had changed. Ships we did not recognize, larger and clearly built with lessons learned from the previous engagements, waited for us in a formation that left no obvious weakness for our commanders to exploit. A final transmission arrived before the engagement began, and this time the voice belonged to someone I had not heard before, a woman who identified herself as Admiral Claire Doyle, speaking with a steadiness that somehow felt heavier than any anger could have. "Commanders of the Asanth Dominion," she said, "we have tracked your fleet's approach for the past 11 days. We know its size. We know it represents a significant portion of your remaining military strength. We are offering you one final opportunity, Not because we believe you deserve it, but because we would prefer this conflict end without requiring the losses that are about to occur. Withdraw now, and we will begin discussions on lasting terms between our peoples. Proceed, and there will be no further offers of this kind, for as long as either of our species exists. The Dominion Fleet Commander, an officer named Grath Ossel, who had replaced Thesic Vrol in overall authority, ordered the advance without hesitation, dismissing the warning as exactly the kind of bluff he believed our previous commanders had foolishly accepted as genuine. I said nothing, though I already knew, with a certainty that felt like grief settling into my chest before the loss had even occurred, exactly how this would unfold. The engagement that followed lasted less than 6 hours, and it did not resemble a battle so much as a systematic dismantling. Human ships moved with a coordination that made our 900 vessels look disorganized, despite outnumbering them more than 3 to 1. They targeted command ships first, disabling communication and coordination across our formation within the opening minutes, leaving individual Asanth squadrons cut off from central command and forced to make decisions without the guidance our doctrine had always relied upon. I watched from the tactical station as squadron after squadron reported losses, some disabled, increasing numbers simply destroyed outright as the engagement progressed. The earlier restraint I had witnessed in previous encounters clearly abandoned now that the scale of our aggression had crossed whatever threshold Peter Lang had once described to me during my captivity. This was no longer a demonstration meant to teach a lesson while sparing lives where possible. This was an ending, delivered with the same calm precision humanity had shown from the very first engagement, only now without any restraint softening the outcome. Grath Ossel's flagship, positioned near the center of our formation where he believed himself best protected, was struck directly during the 3rd hour of the engagement. I was aboard a support vessel some distance away when it happened, close enough to receive the full sensor readings as they came through, watching the display show his ship's systems failing one after another until all readings simply stopped. There was no final transmission, no warning. One moment, his vessel was coordinating what remained of our formation, and the next, it was simply gone from our sensors entirely, along with every officer aboard it. I had served under many commanders across 3 centuries, but something about watching Grath Ossel's destruction, distant and impersonal as it was through a sensor readout rather than something I witnessed directly, affected me more deeply than I expected. Perhaps because his death represented, more clearly than anything before it, the final collapse of every assumption my people had built our entire military doctrine around. We had believed strength in numbers could overcome any technological gap. We had believed our discipline and experience, built over centuries of successful conquest, would eventually reassert itself once the enemy's initial advantages were absorbed and understood. None of that proved true. Humanity simply continued adapting faster than we could, learning from every engagement in ways that made each subsequent battle worse for us rather than better. By the time the engagement ended, our fleet of 900 vessels had been reduced to fewer than 200 functional ships, most of those severely damaged, limping away from the system under emergency power with no clear direction beyond simple survival. I found myself, along with a handful of surviving officers, aboard one of the few vessels still capable of sustained flight, tasked with the grim responsibility of returning to Dominion space to deliver a report that I already knew would be received with the same denial that had met every previous warning I had offered. It was during the return journey that a transmission reached our surviving fleet, broadcast not to negotiate or threaten, but simply, it seemed, to be heard. The voice belonged to Admiral Claire Doyle once again, and her words were carried not just to our fleet, but, we later learned, across every frequency capable of reaching Dominion space, intended for any remaining Asanth ears willing to listen. "To the Asanth Dominion," she said, "you have now engaged our species on 3 separate occasions, each time with greater force, each time believing the previous outcome was an anomaly rather than a clear demonstration of consequence. We want to be entirely clear about what happens from this point forward, so that no future generation of your people can claim they did not understand the terms of what you chose to begin. We do not seek your extinction as a goal in itself. We have never sought that, and we take no satisfaction in the losses your people have already suffered. But we will not allow a civilization that has subdued 84 other species through fear and force to continue operating under the assumption that our world was simply the 85th entry on that list. Every fleet you send against us from this point forward will be met, and every fleet you send will be reduced to nothing, until either your leadership chooses a different path, or there is no leadership left capable of choosing anything at all. This is not a threat. It is a description of what will continue to happen, exactly as it has happened 3 times already, for as long as it takes. Those words spread through Dominion space faster than any official report could have contained them, carried by surviving crew members who had witnessed the destruction firsthand and could not stay silent about what they had seen. I do not know exactly when the phrase began circulating among common citizens rather than just military officers, but within weeks, Admiral Claire Doyle's words had become something close to a warning spoken in fearful whispers across every Asanth world that had heard them. I returned to Dominion space to find a council no longer united in its confidence, though still divided sharply between those who, like myself, believed further conflict would only end in total destruction, and those who continued to insist that one final, sufficiently massive effort would finally break humanity's resistance. I argued, as forcefully as I was permitted, that we had already tested that theory 3 times, each time with greater losses than the last, and that continuing down this path represented not strength, but a refusal to accept a truth that had already been demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt. I was not alone in this belief by that point. Several other surviving officers, having witnessed the same losses firsthand, joined me in urging the Council toward negotiation rather than further escalation. But the Council remained split, and in the absence of a unified decision, individual border commanders began making their own choices, some withdrawing forces defensively, others, driven by pride or desperation or simple refusal to accept defeat, launching smaller unauthorized strikes against human colonies that had begun expanding into contested space during the ceasefire periods between our larger engagements. Every one of those unauthorized strikes ended exactly as the larger engagements had, though on a smaller scale, further eroding what little unified strength the Dominion had left. I watched from what remained of my position within the fleet command structure as our once vast military strength eroded piece by piece, not through a single decisive defeat, but through a slow accumulation of losses driven by a leadership unable to accept that the old doctrine of fear and overwhelming force simply did not apply to this particular species. By the time the Council finally agreed, far too late, to seek genuine negotiation rather than further conflict, humanity's response made clear that the window for that option had already closed. The transmission that arrived in answer to our formal request for terms was brief, and it came not from Admiral Claire Doyle this time, but from a voice I did not recognize, calm and final in a way that told me, before a single word was fully translated, exactly what was coming next. "We received your request for terms," the voice said. "That request comes after 4 separate engagements, 3 of them initiated entirely by your forces, and after your leadership spent the better part of a year unable to agree on a single unified response, despite every warning we provided along the way. We do not believe further negotiation would produce anything but a temporary pause before your council attempts this again once it believes the timing favors a different outcome. We have therefore made the decision to end this permanently, on our terms, rather than continue accepting the risk that comes with trusting a leadership structure that has shown us, repeatedly, that it does not fully understand the concept of a final warning." I remember sitting in the council chamber when that transmission finished playing, surrounded by officials who had spent the past year arguing endlessly over strategy, while humanity simply continued preparing, methodically and without haste, for exactly this moment. Nobody spoke for a long time after the transmission ended. There was nothing left to argue about. The decision had already been made, not by us, but by the species we had once dismissed as primitive, insignificant, and beneath our notice. What followed over the next several months did not resemble war in any form my people had ever recorded across our long history of conquest. War, as we understood it, involved fleets meeting in open space, victories and losses traded back and forth. Negotiations eventually reached once both sides recognized the cost had grown too high to continue. What humanity brought to our doorstep instead was something closer to a methodical unwinding of everything the Dominion had ever built, carried out with a patience that felt, to those of us watching it unfold, far more unsettling than open aggression ever could have been. They did not send fleets against our capital immediately. Instead, human forces began appearing at the edges of our territory, at border worlds and supply routes we had always considered secure simply by virtue of being far from any conflict. Colonies that provided resources to our military found those supply lines quietly interrupted. Communication relays that connected distant Osanth worlds to Central Command began falling silent, not destroyed outright, but rendered inoperable in ways our engineers struggled to even diagnose, let alone repair. I remember a report reaching the Council from a mining colony on the outer edge of our territory, describing human vessels that had simply appeared in orbit, disabled the colony's defensive systems within minutes, and then broadcast a message to the population below rather than initiating any attack. The message, according to the report, informed the colonists that their world's resources would no longer be permitted to support Dominion military operations, and that any attempt to circumvent this restriction would be addressed directly. The human ships then departed without further incident, leaving the colony fully intact but effectively severed from any meaningful role in what remained of our war effort. This pattern repeated across dozens of worlds over the following weeks. Not conquest in the way our doctrine understood conquest. Isolation, careful, deliberate isolation, cutting the Dominion's military capacity away, piece by piece, while leaving civilian populations largely untouched, as though humanity had decided that our leadership, not our people, represented the actual target of everything that followed. I raised this observation during a council session, suggesting that this approach, however unsettling, at least indicated a continued unwillingness on humanity's part to pursue total destruction. One of the remaining council members, an elder named Karen Pierce, who had survived 3 of our previous engagements as a fleet observer, offered a response that I have never forgotten. "Do not mistake restraint toward our civilians for hesitation toward us," she said. "I believe they intend to remove every capability we possess to threaten them again, regardless of whether that requires our complete destruction or simply our complete disarmament. I do not believe they have decided yet which outcome this will become, and I believe that decision depends entirely on what choices we continue to make from this point forward." The Council, even after everything that had already happened, remained divided on how to respond. Some argued for immediate and total surrender, offering unconditional terms in the hope of preserving whatever remained of our military and civilian infrastructure. Others, driven by a stubbornness I had come to recognize as our species' deepest flaw, continued arguing that some combination of remaining resources and desperate strategy could still turn the tide, if only given enough time to properly organize a response. That division proved fatal, though not in the way anyone expected. While the Council debated, unable to reach consensus, a faction of remaining Dominion military officers, acting without any official authorization, gathered what ships remained under their command and launched a final, desperate assault directly against a human colony that had recently been established near what we still considered contested space. Their goal, as best I could determine afterward, was to force humanity into a large-scale engagement that might somehow shift the balance of the conflict back in our favor, or at the very least, force a negotiation from a position that did not feel like complete surrender. I want to be honest about what I know of that engagement, because I did not witness it directly, and much of what reached me afterward came through fragmented reports and the accounts of the very few survivors who managed to escape. What is certain is that the colony in question was not the undefended target the attacking officers believed it to be. What is equally certain is that no ship among that unauthorized force returned. 3 days later, a transmission reached every remaining Osant world simultaneously, broadcast across every frequency our species had ever used for communication, civilian and military alike. I heard it myself, standing in what remained of the Central Command facility on our capital world, surrounded by officials who had spent the past year failing, again and again, to accept the reality in front of them. This is Earth Defense Command, addressing the Asanth Dominion and any remaining forces still operating under its authority. The transmission began, spoken by a voice I did not recognize, calm in a way that felt final rather than threatening. 3 days ago, a Dominion force attacked a civilian colony under our protection, acting without what we understand to be official authorization from your remaining leadership. We recognize that your council did not sanction this action. We also recognize that your council has proven, across 5 separate engagements, unable to prevent actions like this one from occurring regardless of intention. We can no longer treat the distinction between your official leadership and your rogue elements as meaningful, because the outcome for us remains the same either way. We have therefore concluded that partial measures, isolation, disarmament, restraint, intended to preserve your civilization while removing its capacity for aggression, are no longer sufficient to guarantee our safety. What follows will not be a negotiation. It will not be a demonstration. It is the conclusion your leadership was warned about, repeatedly, across every engagement that preceded this moment. We take no satisfaction in this. We simply no longer believe any other outcome protects what we are responsible for protecting. I do not have adequate words to describe what followed over the next several weeks, though I will try, because I believe the truth of it matters more than my own discomfort in recounting it. Human forces moved through Dominion space with a speed and coordination that made our previous engagements look almost gentle by comparison. Military installations were dismantled entirely, not merely disabled. Shipyards, weapons manufacturing facilities, training academies, every piece of infrastructure connected even distantly to our capacity to wage war, systematically rendered permanently inoperable across dozens of worlds within a matter of days. Civilian populations, as best as I could confirm through the fragmented reports still reaching Central Command, were largely relocated rather than harmed, transported to designated worlds under human oversight, while their former homes were stripped of anything resembling military capability. I do not say this to suggest kindness on humanity's part. I say it because even in this final absolute conclusion to our conflict, they maintained the same distinction they had shown from the very beginning, between a civilization's capacity to threaten them, which they intended to end completely, and the individual lives of people who had simply been born into that civilization, which they continued, even now, to treat with a measure of care I do not believe my own species would have extended in the reverse situation. Our capital world itself was the last to be addressed. I remained there throughout, unable and unwilling to flee, watching as our once great dominion, a power that had subdued 84 other species across countless centuries, arrived at its own final chapter at the hands of a species we had once dismissed as too primitive to even understand the danger we represented. Human forces arrived in orbit without fanfare, without a lengthy demonstration, without the kind of theatrical warning our own doctrine had always relied upon. A single transmission reached the surface, brief and unambiguous, informing what remained of our leadership that all remaining military assets would be dismantled, that our capacity to threaten any other civilization was being permanently removed, and that the survival of our species, in whatever form remained possible after this process concluded, depended entirely on our full and complete cooperation with what followed. We cooperated. There was, by that point, nothing left to do but cooperate. I will not describe in detail everything that occurred during those final weeks, partly because much of it remains difficult for me to revisit even now, and partly because the details matter less than the outcome itself. Every shipyard was dismantled. Every weapons facility was rendered permanently unusable. Every record of our military doctrine, our conquest history, our 84 previous subjugations, was collected, studied, and in most cases, permanently sealed away from any future access by our own people, as though humanity wanted to ensure that even the memory of what we had once been capable of could not serve as inspiration for whoever came after us. The Dominion, as a political and military entity, ceased to exist within a single year of that unauthorized attack on the human colony. Not through the deaths of every Asanth individual, though many were lost across the various engagements that preceded this final conclusion, but through the complete and permanent removal of everything that had made us a threat to any other civilization ever again. Our name became, within human records and eventually within the records of other species who learned of what had happened, a cautionary example rather than a military power. Complete and utter annihilation, not of a people, but of a capability, delivered with a thoroughness that ensured no future generation would ever need to relearn the lesson our leadership had refused to learn the first 4 times it was offered. I am recording this account many years later, an old Asanth, living out the remainder of my life on a world I no longer fully recognize, having watched my species rebuild itself slowly under terms we did not choose but eventually came to accept as fair, given everything that preceded them. I do not share this story out of bitterness, though I will admit some part of me still carries the weight of everything I witnessed. I share it because I believe every civilization that encounters humanity in the future deserves to understand something my own people learned far too late, and at far too great a cost. They do not seek conflict. Every account I have given you, every engagement I witnessed personally, began with a genuine warning, delivered plainly and without deception, offering a path away from destruction that remained open far longer than our own doctrine ever would have allowed in the reverse situation. But once that warning is ignored, once genuine restraint is repeatedly mistaken for weakness, humanity does not simply respond in kind. They do not seek a balanced exchange of losses. They seek an ending so complete that the question of whether to test them again never arises for anyone watching from a distance. If you are hearing this account from somewhere among the stars, having encountered humanity yourselves, or having heard rumors of what happened to species like mine, I offer you the only advice I have left to give. Listen to the warnings when they come. They will come clearly, and they will come more than once. What happened to my people was not inevitability. It was choice, made repeatedly by leadership that refused to accept a truth offered to us again and again until there was nothing left to refuse. What happened to the last species that defied humans was complete and utter annihilation, not of our lives, but of everything we once believed made us powerful. I hope, for whoever encounters them next, that this account is remembered before the same lesson needs to be taught again.